So, Jesus had been born. Joseph and Mary had dealt with that pretty scary situation. And so now everything was going to be roses and puppies, right? Well, approximately 2 years later, Joseph and Mary are hanging out in a house. We don't know exactly whose house, was it theirs or whatever. And they get a knock on the door, and we don't know how many there were, but these foreigners showed up. And I'm sure that one of Joseph's first thoughts was, what now? Right? I mean, 2 years had passed. People had probably kind of put the whole idea of Mary maybe being unfaithful to Joseph out of their mind and things like that. And so these guys show up. Well, then Joseph gets another message in a dream. Apparently, Joseph was a lot better about listening in his dreams than he was when he was awake. But Joseph gets a message from the angel. Fly to Egypt. Flee to Egypt. Escape to Egypt. And I'm sure Joseph was thinking once again, what now? So with these words kind of echoing in his ear, Joseph took Mary and Jesus and went to Egypt. Now, what's interesting is this story is only told out of the four Gospels, only told in Matthew. And what's interesting is that the names and faces may change, but it's a story that continues to be lived out in lands throughout the world today. We've seen the pictures, we've read the news, we've heard and maybe even participated in the arguments or discussions over what to do with this particular situation. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were not the first refugees, and they're not going to be the last. So when you hear today's gospel message, the flight to Egypt, what feelings come to mind? What images fill your mind's eye? What maybe prayers come to mind? What experiences do you recall from your own life? And maybe you're wondering, what does this have to do with you and me? Or maybe you're asking, what now? You know, for me, I picture a little boy and his mom and dad, violence, of course, because we know what Herod did to the infant boys later on. A tyrant ruler, obviously Herod. An oppressive government that was doing whatever Herod wanted. I know he was the king, but come on. And the threat of death, all of these things had this family on the run. They left behind more than what they had taken. I feel the parents' fear, and that knot that they probably had in their stomach. I am certain that their one thought was to take care of this child. I mean, let's be honest. The only reason they were being chased was because of Jesus. It wasn't because of Mary and Joseph. I have no doubt that they have that fear as they're running away in the darkness, hoping not to be noticed. With each moment getting further and further from the known and the familiar, and it getting a lot closer to the unknown and the unfamiliar. I have no doubt maybe they were thinking it in their own minds, or maybe they were even talking to each other. What will we do when we get there? How much further is it? What will we find? What will it be like? Or maybe even, what now? Now the thing is, I'm not only talking about Jesus and his parents, I'm also talking about political refugees everywhere. Because, let's be honest, Jesus and his family were political refugees. I mean, you can't argue with that. They were fleeing a king who was seeking to destroy Jesus, who was a challenge to Herod's authority. They were a family seeking asylum in a foreign land. They very likely had no connections to Egypt whatsoever, either through family or friends, and so had to rely on the kindness minds of strangers. You see, we have to remember that Jesus was the Word become flesh. Human flesh. Flesh like yours. Flesh like mine. Jesus came down and not only shared the fact that he was human, but he was divine. It means that anything can remind us of that. That seeking, that finding. After all, God's heart is with the refugee. And the birth of Jesus and the angel of the Lord who spoke to Joseph in a dream and in Jesus' family's flight to Egypt, God has revealed himself to be aligned with the refugees of this world, which does include you and me. Probably never thought of yourself as a refugee before, have you? It never occurred to you that you too are a refugee? Anybody else pick up on that? I called you a refugee. Jesus is the face of a refugee humanity. A humanity you and I share. In Jesus' face, we see the spark that ignites hope, that kindles the fire of love, brings light to the darkness for all refugees. This story, this really interesting story that's only found in one gospel, challenges us with our own refugee status, our own label as refugees, and brings to mind the times we have fled to our own Egypt. And in fact, some of you may be on that road now. If your life has ever been disrupted and you need a safe place to get away to. If you've ever known that it was no longer safe or good for you to stay right where you are or doing right what you're doing. If you've ever left the known and familiar for the unknown and the unfamiliar. If you've ever realized that your life was at risk and you needed to make a change. If your survival depends on crossing borders into new and foreign land. If you've ever experienced these things or thousands of others that we can name, you know what it's like to be a refugee. And I'm pretty sure we can all identify somewhere, can't we? Maybe not political refugees, but refugees. Now, granted, we probably aren't going to have the same experiences as Jesus and his family, but we share a common story and a common status. Herod is not just a king in Israel some 2,000 years ago. In every age, there is a Herod. A Herod who's the power or the circumstances or the abuses that disrupt and seek to destroy life. Herod is the one who creates refugees. For every refugee, there is a Herod. And there are all sorts of refugees and all kinds of Herods. What's interesting is there's actually a couple of evangelical pastors that have made a point of saying, you've all heard the phrase, keeping Christ in Christmas. You've all heard that phrase, right? Which is great. I mean, we should. But they're talking about keeping Herod in Christmas. To understand and reflect upon what was going on. And I think that's a valid point, isn't it? We have to recognize what was going on with this story. All of these things, all of these negative and harmful and terrible things were because of a Herod. And each of us has a Herod. You see, being a refugee is not only about tyrant kings, oppressive governments, or even threats of death, but it's also about a deep longing and drive for a new life and a new place in life. It's hearing and responding to that nighttime calling of God. The refugee life is not easy, and it's not safe. But the great thing is we never go alone. We go with the God of refugee. The God who had nowhere to lay his head. We go with the promise that our Egypt has already been sanctified and prepared for our presence. It's not safe, is it? It's not safe to be a refugee. Whatever your Herod looks like, whatever your Egypt looks like, it's not safe. Anybody think signing up to be a follower of Christ was going to be easy? This should be your light bulb moment if you haven't picked up on that. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be safe. And to be perfectly honest, sometimes it's not even fun. You're being persecuted. You're getting picked on. You've been called names that you don't say in church. Some are refugees from maybe a marriage or a relationship that was unhealthy, destructive, or violent. Some are refugees from the land of addiction. Some are refugees wandering through the darkness of depression, emptiness, or maybe even living a life that feels void of any meaning. Some are fleeing the countries of neglect or abuse. A lot of us, I think, can recognize behaviors and choices that we had to remove ourselves from. We had to flee. Most of us have probably been refugees from the land of grief and sorrow. Now, I don't know what your refugee story is. I have no idea. But I'll bet you have one. I'll bet you had at least one time in your life when you had to flee to your Egypt. Maybe your life actually physically depended on it. You left home for a better place, a different life, a new way. And you left not really knowing where you're going or what you would find when you got there. You trusted God to see you through. You followed in the steps of Jesus and his family. And with each step along the way, your life was a retelling of today's gospel message. Maybe you even asked yourself on more than one occasion, "Oh Lord, what now?" You ever had those moments? I can't be the only one. You know, I heard a quote one time, it's not how many times you got knocked down, it's how many times you got back up. And I think that's really important for us to remember. But every time I hear the message from today, every time I read about refugees in today's news, every time I reflect on my own refugee status in my times in my Egypt, I can't help but wonder, what if? What if Egypt had closed the borders of its heart? What if Jesus and his family had arrived to only find a big wall and locked doors? What if the wannabe pharaohs had unleashed on them fear and prejudice? What if the Egyptian people had said, "There's no room for you here"? So what story would we be telling today then? Would there be good news for the refugees of this world? For you? For me? Would that spark have been extinguished? We really don't know, do we? I mean, we don't know what God's plan is on all this. That's part of the trust. That's part of that trust that we have to put in God. Saying, I don't know what is going to happen now, but I trust you that you do, and that you have my best interest in mind. But we don't have to wonder, do we? We don't have to guess what would happen, because Egypt did remember. Maybe Egypt remembered another time, another Joseph, another refugee people. Perhaps God sent this very special family to the land that would remember. Perhaps God was hoping and counting on Egypt to remember it had once been a place of refuge for his people. And yes, it could be again. I pray that we remember that as well. We remember Jesus and his family, the refugees in the news, our own flights to Egypt. We have to remember that. With our new vision statement, our new way of looking at ministries, I want you to think about that question. What now? And very often, when we think of that question, what now? Can you almost hear that sigh when you think of what now? That question. What now? I can't be the only one that does that, right? But the thing is, when we ask that question instead, it should be, what now? Because we should be excited that we've been given opportunities to do something new, to do something different. Not for our own benefits, but for the refugees of the world. Whether it's a refugee from physical, mental, emotional, and very much spiritual needs. These people are our neighbors, our friends, our family. And when somebody comes knocking at your door, looking as a refugee, do you ask, what now? Or do you say it with conviction, with excitement, what now? I know for a fact I've had plans for my day. And sometimes God says, yeah, that's nice, but that ain't going to happen today. Because he's got different plans for me. So yeah, there are times I would get that sigh because somebody stopped by the office. Or I'd be going to visit somebody and I'd get a phone call. And you know what? Every single time, I've been so thrilled that I've been given the opportunity. Even though sometimes I start out with a sigh. I get a touch of happiness afterwards. God has answered my what now questions in ways sometimes I didn't know. Are you going to be the answer for a refugee out there? Are you going to be an answer? You bow your heads with me, please. Lord God, let us keep in mind that question, what now?